In the quiet, upper-class London suburb of Kensington, the Warren family was known for their wealth, elegance, and polished reputation. James Warren, a successful entrepreneur in his early 50s, lived with his wife, Katherine, a devoted homemaker who organized charity events and hosted dinner parties that were the talk of their circle. Together, they had one son, Lucas, a bright 22-year-old who had recently graduated and was set to take over his father's business someday. The Warrens lived an enviable life, beautiful home, lavish vacations, and a picture-perfect family that masked the cracks in their seemingly unbreakable bond. But the equilibrium of this family would soon be shattered by a force none of them anticipated. When Lucas returned home that summer, he brought along Sophie, his new girlfriend, whom he had met in university. Sophie was 20, with a vibrant spirit and charm that captivated anyone she encountered. From the moment she walked into the Warren home, Sophie had an energy that seemed to fill the entire house. With her vivacious laugh, her striking looks, and her easy confidence, she quickly became a favorite in the household. Initially, James thought nothing of his admiration for Sophie. She was his son's girlfriend, after all, and he was a happily married man. But as the days turned into weeks, James found himself drawn to Sophie's company more than he cared to admit. Their casual conversations, once light and fleeting, grew longer and more intimate. Katherine didn't think twice about leaving them alone to chat, trusting both her husband and her son's girlfriend without question. James began making small excuses to see Sophie, offering to take her to the art galleries he frequented or to show her the hidden nooks of London he had grown fond of over the years. Sophie, thrilled by the attention from such a successful and sophisticated man, reciprocated with a flirtatious innocence. At first it was harmless, a playful touch on his arm, a lingering glance. But soon Sophie felt something she hadn't expected. The admiration she initially felt for James grew into something deeper, something dangerous. One evening, James invited Sophie to join him for a private tour of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Lucas was out with friends and Katherine was attending a charity gala. The museum, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, felt almost magical as they strolled through the exhibits. James pointed out pieces that held special meaning to him, their voices barely above a whisper in the quiet hallways. They shared laughter, quiet moments, and glances that lingered a moment too long. The tension between them was undeniable. As they stood before a painting depicting a classic romantic scene, James felt a sudden surge of desire. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from Sophie's face. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them faded. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand found his, fingers intertwining as they both surrendered to the thrill of the forbidden. A quiet whisper from Sophie, urging him to kiss her, was all it took. Under the soft museum lights, their lips met, igniting a passion neither had expected to find. Their affair blossomed quickly. When Lucas and Katherine weren't around, they stole private moments together. James would find reasons to leave the office early, while Sophie would feign appointments or errands to cover for her absences. The risk, the secrecy, made every touch, every kiss feel electric. They would meet in discreet locations, a quiet cafe tucked away from prying eyes, a secluded spot in Hyde Park, or even in the dim, candlelit corners of James's office. One afternoon, while Katherine was out of town visiting relatives, James invited Sophie over under the pretense of needing her opinion on some artwork for the house. As she entered the Warren home, her heart raced, and she felt the thrill of danger creeping into her veins. James led her upstairs to a private study, where they found themselves alone in the silence of the grand, luxurious home. Their passion escalated, unbridled, as they gave in to the tension that had been building for weeks. Each encounter became more intoxicating than the last, leaving them both craving more, unable to stop despite the consequences that loomed on the horizon. Yet the thrill came with a cost. James's behavior changed around Katherine. He grew distant, irritable, and more withdrawn. Katherine noticed, but assumed it was the stress from his demanding career. Lucas, however, grew suspicious. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about his father and Sophie's interactions didn't sit right with him. He would catch them exchanging glances or sharing quiet laughter that seemed just a bit too familiar. The gnawing feeling that something was amiss began to eat away at him. In a desperate attempt to clarify his suspicions, Lucas decided to confront Sophie. One late evening, after everyone had retired for the night, Lucas found her alone in the sitting room, her gaze fixed out the window. Taking a deep breath, he sat down beside her, the air thick with unspoken words. "Sophie," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. Is there something going on with my father?" Sophie's face went pale, her eyes widening as she struggled to find an answer. The guilt she had been suppressing surged forward, and she stammered, "Lucas, it's not what you think." But her voice betrayed her, quivering with shame and fear. The crack was all Lucas needed, and he stormed away, feeling betrayed and furious. Later that night, a tense confrontation ensued. Lucas confronted his father, demanding to know the truth. James, cornered and overwhelmed, tried to deny everything but eventually broke down, admitting his feelings for Sophie. Katherine overheard the confrontation and was devastated, her trust shattered. She couldn't fathom that the man she had loved for so many years would betray her with their son's girlfriend. The family was thrown into chaos, with hurt and anger lingering in every corner of the house. The next day, Sophie tried to break things off with James, realizing the destruction their affair had caused. But James wasn't ready to let go. He felt as if Sophie was the one thing that gave his life meaning again, something that reignited his spirit. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of watching her walk away. "I can't just forget you, Sophie," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "This wasn't just a fling for me. You're everything I've wanted." But Sophie, with a heavy heart, shook her head. "James, we can't keep doing this. It's hurting everyone, and I can't live with that guilt. It's over." Heartbroken and consumed with anger, James was left in despair, his world crumbling around him. The once vibrant and adventurous man was now a shell, haunted by the specter of his actions and the knowledge that he had destroyed his family. Yet, a dark resolve began to grow within him, a desperation to reclaim what he had lost. Or so he thought. James couldn't let Sophie go. The affair had awakened something within him, a purpose, a new passion that he hadn't felt in years. In his mind, Sophie was more than just a fleeting romance. She was his escape, his last chance to break free from the stifling confines of his life. The idea of losing her to his son was unbearable. He became obsessed, his thoughts consumed by ways to win her back, to make her see that they belonged together. But Sophie had made up her mind. The guilt weighed heavily on her, and despite James's desperate calls and messages, she resolved to sever all ties with him. For a while, she avoided the Warrens entirely, but it wasn't long before Lucas convinced her to come back, assuring her that things would settle down. Sophie, attempting to move past the chaos, focused on her relationship with Lucas, hoping to repair the damage she had caused. Meanwhile, James's desperation grew into a dark, dangerous fixation. He would park outside Sophie's apartment, watching her window, waiting for a glimpse of her. He sent her letters, pleading with her to reconsider, each one more frantic than the last. But Sophie refused to respond, hoping he would finally understand that their affair was over. However, it only fueled James's obsession. In his twisted mind, she was rejecting him because of Lucas, and the thought gnawed at him relentlessly. The tension in the Warren household became unbearable. Katherine barely spoke to James, her heart broken by his betrayal, while Lucas kept a close watch on him, deeply suspicious of his father's every move. The family's once perfect image had crumbled, replaced by an atmosphere of bitterness and mistrust. One evening, James couldn't contain his anger any longer. After drinking heavily, he drove to Sophie's apartment, determined to see her face to face. He banged on her door, shouting her name, but she refused to let him in. From inside, she pleaded with him to leave, fearing for her safety as his voice grew louder, more erratic. The neighbors began to notice, and someone eventually called the police. When they arrived, James was forced to leave, humiliated and seething with rage. This public rejection, combined with his escalating obsession, pushed him over the edge. James decided he couldn't simply let Sophie walk away, not after everything they'd shared. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one could. The decision solidified like stone within him, a chilling resolve that left no room for doubt. On a cold, gray Saturday morning, he made his final preparations. Knowing that Lucas would be away for a work event and Katherine out of town, he drove to Sophie's apartment with a grim sense of purpose. The streets were quiet and the clouds hung low, casting an eerie silence over the neighborhood. He waited in his car, watching until he saw Sophie leave her building and walk down the sidewalk. She was alone. James followed her, keeping a safe distance until she turned into a nearby park, a secluded area she often visited to clear her mind. He approached her slowly, his hands trembling as he called her name. Sophie turned, her expression shifting from surprise to dread as she saw the look in his eyes. "James, what are you doing here?" she stammered, glancing around, but there was no one nearby. "You didn't answer my calls, Sophie. I couldn't just let things end like this." His voice was unsteady, a mix of desperation and something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. "James, please, this isn't healthy. We need to move on," she said, taking a step back, but he moved closer, blocking her path. "You don't understand, Sophie. I gave up everything for you. I risked everything. And now you think you can just walk away?" His voice grew louder, a tremor of fury edging each word. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "But it's over. You need to accept that." The rejection, so final and absolute, broke something inside him. With a sudden, violent impulse, he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. Sophie struggled, screaming, but he clamped a hand over her mouth, his grip tightening as his anger turned to a brutal force. In his frenzied state, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a knife he had brought with him, his mind a blur of rage and betrayal. The first strike was quick, slicing through the cold morning air and piercing her side. Sophie gasped, her body going limp as the blood began to stain her clothes. But James didn't stop. He plunged the knife into her again and again, each strike fueled by a twisted sense of betrayal, a warped belief that this was the only way to make her his forever. When he finally stopped, panting and drenched in her blood, he looked down at what he had done. Sophie lay motionless, her lifeless eyes staring up at him. The reality of his actions settled over him like a suffocating fog, and for the first time he felt the horror of his own monstrosity. The girl he had once loved, the girl he had given up everything for, lay dead at his feet. James stumbled back, wiping the blood from his hands as he tried to compose himself. In a daze, he fled the scene, leaving Sophie's body in the park, hidden among the trees. He drove back home, his mind racing with the dread of what he'd just done. He tried to wash away the blood, scrub it from his clothes and skin, but no matter how hard he scrubbed, the crimson stains seemed to cling to him. The next morning, Sophie's body was discovered by a jogger, and the police were quickly called. The investigation began, and as word of Sophie's death spread, shockwaves rippled through the community. The Warrens were devastated, Lucas especially, as he grappled with the horror of losing someone he loved so brutally. It didn't take long for the detectives to suspect James. Witnesses reported his outburst outside Sophie's apartment, and a security camera caught his car near the park on the morning of her murder. As the pieces began to come together, the police grew convinced that James was responsible. When they confronted him with the evidence, he broke down, his confession spilling out in a torrent of guilt and remorse. In the trial that followed, the sordid details of James and Sophie's affair were laid bare for the world to see. Katherine sat in the courtroom, numb with disbelief, while Lucas struggled to contain his anger and heartbreak. The man they had once loved and trusted was now a stranger, a monster capable of unspeakable acts. The jury found James guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Warren family was left shattered, the bonds that had once held them together now irreparably broken. Katherine and Lucas moved away, unable to bear the memory of what had happened. The story of James Warren's descent from a respected businessman to a cold-blooded killer became a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of the destructive power of obsession and betrayal. The quiet suburb of Kensington would never be the same, haunted by the memory of a family destroyed by a love that was never meant to be.